here's what Katrina and I often use as the sort of process for this. Um, post the position, then applications start being submitted. And then, those dots in the timeline, because like time passes, we talked about last week, like, is it 2 weeks? Is it 4 weeks? And then at some point we need to start screening the applications against the knowledge, skills, and abilities. And so what does that process look like? As we all probably do, like, do you do that on a rolling basis as they're coming in, or do you wait until everything is closed and then do it all at once? And for me, I find like it depends on the role. Like, maybe we want to do it on a rolling basis if we think there'll be fewer applications coming in. It's usually a more specialized, higher level positions when I might do it on a rolling basis, because I don't want to wait 3 weeks and then know, like, we really need to do some other outreach in different ways. But if I know, like, we're gonna get 500 applications and there's probably gonna be 50 people we could hire for one role, it might be like, let's just wait and do this all at once. This is also, my default is more of a endurance sport. I'd rather sit down all at once to do this, to find the time. But a lot of colleagues who work with, like, no, I need to do like 1 hour a day over time. So it's really sort of personal preference, but also calibrating that with your funnel size. I saw Kate, you mentioned screeners. This is where, like, is round one the screener, or do you have a pre-screener before then, just to get some different data in? And we talked last week around, like, what's the minimum that we need from a candidate in order to vet against the knowledge, skills, and abilities, so that we don't create additional hurdles for them to be in the process. So maybe you want to do just 20-minute just phone screeners or Zoom screeners, so that someone can only has to submit their resume. And then you use those screeners against the resume, or maybe it's just a cover letter, to then get into, like, all right, so tell us about your arc as it relates to these three anchors. And then really thinking about a formal round 1, 2, and 3, and interspersing these structured debriefs that Katrina will sort of sketch out with the rubric. The thing that is interesting to add in here, and this oftentimes needs someone external who's not in the process, but, like, how do you check in with the candidate throughout a process? Like, is there a check-in that happens between round 2 and round 3 where you find out maybe what they still are interested in, want to know, so that as you're building the rounds, again, it's sort of this building the plane while we're flying it, we can create the rounds bespoke to the candidate pool that we have at the time, that might be different from what we thought going into it. And so getting that data to sit down with candidates as human beings, again, oftentimes that you need that external person to do it, not maybe a member of the hiring committee, but if you use external search consultant or something, maybe that's the person to do it. There's that psychological safety that might exist there. And then round 3, I have always found round 3 to be magical. I've gone into so many searches, and I'm curious what examples here. I've gone into so many searches thinking that we knew what the order was. Like, really, we totally could hire that person coming out of round 2. And then you go into round 3, and 9 times out of 10, that order completely shifts. And I don't know if it's like people come on strong at the beginning and sort of burn out during the process, or some people evolve differently. There's something that happens though, where people coming out of round 1, you're like, superstar, totally should just hire them. Round 2, yeah, they're still, and then round 3 kind of just falls apart so many times. And so I've always been intrigued by this. I'm curious if people have experience with this as well, or maybe it just happens to be me or the people that we're hiring. But it's why I always say, like, get to round 3, see, like, and have each stage be something different. Like, we want to learn different things in each stage, not just asking the same questions, but, like, what is it in round 1 that we need to know about someone? And then what do they need to know about us? Again, like, interspersing that data throughout, so we don't overwhelm people up front. It's interesting with different things. We mentioned last week, like, unless maybe we're looking for an editor or a writer, maybe don't ask for a writing sample up front. One of the cool things but build it into the process. One of the cool things Katrina and I experimented with in our last search was to use the writing sample as an email exchange. And the specific framing was between round 1 and 2 or 2 and 3.
1 and 2.
1 and 2, where and candidates were paid $250 for the work that they had to do in preparation for round 2. Because they were going to do at least 2 hours of work. And so the organization agreed to compensate people for their time at about a like $125 consulting rate. But one of the exercises was, in order to get a bespoke writing sample, we drafted an email from a quote unquote manager so this is for a HR and inclusion role. And the manager was asking this HR and inclusion role's advice because they had someone on their staff who was expressing frustration with how the organization was doing work, anti-racism work and anti-oppression work that was meaning that the organization wouldn't perform the works that they liked. They were like, and so they were asking some advice of this candidate. And so the exercise was the candidates had to respond to that email. And so it was a way of getting a writing sample that was very specifically targeted to the knowledge, skills, and abilities that you would need in this role of like vice president of HR and inclusion. It would allow us to test HR expertise in a way, and also test their leadership in anti-racism work. And those sort of were core anchors that we were testing. So it was another way of working in something, and that maybe that could be around. You could just have that as a round, and then depending on the position, sort of move on from there.
So I think one of the things that I would just kind of add to this conversation is that we try to do a lot in interviews. And so we try to have like one question that helps us to learn about all of these things. And you end up with more questions than you typically have time for. And you want to make time to hear questions from others and things like that. And so the way that we broke it up, and part of the reason why we're suggesting 3 interviews for some of these like more specialized roles is that first one might help you kind of identify knowledge, skills, and abilities. So you can focus your assessment on those knowledge, skills, and abilities. In the second interview, it might be about like, are there some key characteristics or like, values or thought leadership that people have? And so, for example, in our last search, we looked at, how are they listening? How do we test their ability to kind of listen, be humble, and sit in discomfort of doing, change work that relates to anti-oppression and anti-racism? And so those were so we structured the interview and the scenarios to help us learn really specifically about how those candidates were showing up with those questions. And then that third round was, as Tim described, it was like, what other questions do we have? And are there questions that are common throughout the candidates that are kind of left after that second round that would really help us to sort of identify who that candidate might be if we had to make a choice? I think it depends on your pool too. If you have a smaller funnel, or you can do some of that narrowing and screening, and you're taking just a few candidates through, then you might not need 3 interviews, but you want to structure around like, what are those things that are really essential for us to know, and how do we take the time we need in those interviews to actually learn about those things, so that we're making, in the debrief, we're able to bring those different perspectives of the committee members together to really think and be intentional about our learning on those key anchors or those key KSAs.
If we think of it as an experiment, and we think of iterating and then reflecting on like, what did that tell us and what did that not tell us? Because maybe we only have the resources, or in the, and mention like the labor market right now. It's like, all right, so with this in mind, what we can try, what can we experiment with, and then iterate on it next time. And maybe our ideal is 4 interviews, 4 people over X period of 3 months or 2 months, but we can't do that right now because there are other competing things.